Get started with introductions?
Why don't we get started?
All right, let's do it. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today for Beehive's Ask Me Anything, focused on crisis communication and lessons that we've learned from the Silicon Valley Bank and financial crises that have happened over the period of the last several months. My name is Amy Zemke. I am Executive Vice President of Client Experience here at Beehive Strategic Communication. I oversee Beehive's client experience, a number of client organizations that we work with, and I also am a certified crisis expert here at Beehive. So really happy to have you all with us today and look forward to a good conversation.
Hi, everyone. My name is Nikki Gibbs. I'm Chief Strategy Officer here at Beehive. My role in the agency is overseeing a client portfolio and really leading strategic initiatives, which often includes crisis. I also work deeply in product and service development, so partnering closely with Amy and her expertise to help us understand how we can best show up on the topic of crisis for our clients. So we're both excited to be here today. Just a quick note about Beehive. We are Beehive Strategic Communication located in St. Paul, Minnesota. And we work with a number of clients on both internal and external communication as it relates to overall business strategy and outcomes. So really everything from high stakes communication like crisis management to branding, purpose, mission, and values, and also helping organizations understand how they can best show up in the marketplace.
Perfect. All right. Well, with that, do a quick setup on kind of why we're here and how this is going to work. I don't think I need to backtrack too far. I think everyone on this call is probably very familiar with the Silicon Valley Bank issue and some kind of the subsequent industry fallout that occurred starting back in March. And I think that we're still feeling quite a bit of yet today. Really provided a very stark reminder of the critical role that communication takes in a crisis situation. I think specifically this issue really highlighted that as we get into a little more, we'll talk about that. But Nikki and I are really here today to answer any questions you have. As the title implies, this is an Ask Me Anything. So we've got a couple of questions that people submitted ahead of time, and we'll talk through those. But please, as we are going, please submit questions. That really is what will drive a good, high value experience today. We've got about 45 minutes. We're scheduled to go until 1:45. You can submit questions one of two ways. You can either put your question into the chat, or if you want to just ask it verbally, just click the little raise hand function in Teams, and we will unmute you, and you can just ask your question as well. So both work great, and we'll get started with a couple questions that we have already, and look forward to hearing what other questions you all have. So one of the first questions we received is actually a three-part question. Lots of good questions within the questions. So I'm going to pose the first one to Nikki. So the question is, what were examples of the best and worst statements of reassurance of a bank's financial strength? What channels were those best delivered on? For instance, email to customers, social media, website, et cetera. And if the traditional media was asking for comments, would it have been good to respond?
Those are all great questions. I always like to start with the best, as it was a complicated situation. And I think we can all agree that a lot of what transpired for Silicon Valley was their communication was a little bit off the mark. And that really contributed to a lot of uncertainty and panic. So I think we can probably safely go to them for some of the worst statements. But in terms of some of the best, JP Morgan Chase, I think, did a really nice job. And a couple of things that they did that I thought were particularly noteworthy was being very transparent and being very information-based, very fact-based about what was going on inside their organization and really speaking to their key constituents in the channels that meant the most to them. So reaching customers through the channels within which they were accustomed to being addressed and really speaking to their specific situations and not so much commenting on what else was happening in the industry. So I think that was a really smart approach. Part of the challenge that SVB faced on its own, specifically their CEO had some tough times out there in investor calls and some media interviews, making statements along the lines of, just stay calm. We really don't need you to panic right now, as opposed to putting their situation into broader context, being fact-based, talking about steps that were being taken to mitigate the circumstances. And in fact, actually going quiet in a number of channels that they had previously been very active and visible in. So that sort of added to that level of anxiety. So that's a little bit about the statements, but also really speaks to the channels. And that's really understanding who are you talking to? So in a situation like this, certainly you have investors and board members, you have employees, you have customers, prospective customers, and other partners in the community. So I think one of the big takeaways here, particularly for smaller banks and regional and local banks, was really digging into the channels where you already had established relationships. So for example, CEO Becker from SVB had done quite a bit of high profile media prior to this incident, and then really went dark, stepped back, which left people wondering really what was going on. Whereas community banks, regional banks really did a beautiful job of upping their presence in social media, really doing a lot more one-to-one outreach, and in some cases even making more physical opportunities available, doing things like making their bank officers available for in-person questions or extending actual branch hours so that anyone who is feeling concerned or maybe even a little uncomfortable with digital channels or traditional media channels had an opportunity for that face-to-face human connection. So I think those are some of the things that worked really well.
Yeah.
I think the last question was about audience.
Let me look. Last question was, if the traditional media was asking for comments, would it have been good to respond?
So that is always an interesting question in times of crisis. And the answer is, it depends. I think if you are in a position where you have something valuable to comment on, you have a unique point of view or perspective that could be helpful and additive in the situation, it's always a good opportunity to get in front of your customers, get in front of your other key audiences with insightful messaging that underlines your expertise. But I think in situations like this, it needs to be something that's carefully considered and really has an upside for your particular brand or your particular organization. Is it going to help put your customers at ease? Is it going to help reinforce the reputation that you have in the marketplace? Flip side of that would be if your organization typically doesn't comment or make itself available to the media, might not be the best time to dip your toe in water.
Right. And remembering that traditional media is not your only channel, as you just talked about. So in the case of SVB specifically, probably yes, the answer is they should have provided some context. But for other banks, other credit unions, others in the financial industry, should they, be commenting in traditional media? I think to your point, it really does depend. And is that the right channel to communicate? Should you be reassuring customers? Yes. Should you be using traditional media to do that? Well, hard to say. So, depend on the situation, but probably not in that particular case.
If there was a way to localize the situation or reassure community through a more traditional channel, that would be a case for yes. But potentially high stakes and maybe not the best moment.
Yeah, for sure. Great. Thank you.
All right. So we had another question that came in advance, moving a little bit away from the SVB situation, but another couple of high profile crisis situations, asking what can we learn about the ripple effect in crisis communication? For example, the Budweiser backlash and the Harvard Medical School situation.
Yeah, I think there have been so many examples of that ripple effect. SVB being, of course, one of them. Budweiser, Harvard Medical School. There are just so many of those right now. Target, I think you're seeing a lot of those where there's this ripple impact. And sometimes it's a ripple across an industry, which I think SVB was very much an example of. And sometimes it's really rallied around a social issue, like Pride with Budweiser and Target. So I think you do see that ripple effect. And I think, what some of those driving factors are, a couple of things. I think, humans do not naturally use logic in a crisis. They go straight to emotion, and that's human, right? And so you go into that fight or flight. And I think when you combine that with the ability to take action pretty much immediately in real time through digital channels, you kind of get this really interesting firestorm of this ripple effect. So it really does allow for kind of a real-time sense of momentum that can either really target a brand, an individual, an issue. It can also really quickly influence and mobilize a population. And so I think you're seeing more of that these days because I just think there's more ability to do it. And when you're combining that high emotion and frankly higher expectations with the ability to kind of real time take that action in a very public way, you're going to get that ripple effect. And I just think we're seeing more and more of that. So I think, what that means for crisis, I think a number of things. One is that the risk is real. And so really being smart about anticipating risk and really paying attention to the marketplace. So as a communicator, you really should be that business partner in your organization that is watching these macro trends, watching the marketplace and raising your hand if and when you see something start to bubble that could have an impact on your business or your organization. So one is just really being watchful and really future focused about what's happening and what that might mean to your organization. Know who you are before a crisis hits. So, especially if it's a social issue, I mean, and frankly, any issue, really being clear on who you are from a value standpoint, from a mission or a purpose standpoint. Be really clear on that prior to the crisis hitting, because that is what you're going to want to have be your foundation to any kind of a communication. That is going to be critical, and it's going to help you make the right decisions for when to engage, how to engage, what to say. So those are two things I would really focus on. Be really focused on how to shore up support with the stakeholders that matter to your organization. It can be really tempting to try to silence, the loudest people, but those detractors probably are never going to be on your side necessarily, unless of course it's your stakeholders, different situation, but really put your focus on how do I shore up the support of my stakeholders and the people that are important to my organization. And PS, don't forget your employees. Making sure that you're thinking both internally and externally is really, really important. And then I think know when to engage and how to engage. So, silence is hardly ever the right choice because people make it up, right? And then when there's a vacuum and when no one is out there communicating, people will make assumptions, they will make something up, and they're probably going to get it wrong. And so I think, we talked about SVB specifically, there being this kind of gap of communication. People panicked, people made it up, people just made assumptions and started taking action based on what they believed to be true versus what was communicated to be the actual case or the context of what was happening. And I think making sure that, you're using really clear, consistent messaging. I think that, when people are upset, their ability to process information goes down significantly. And so the more that you can make sure that you are communicating in a way that is clear, that has good clarity, and is kind of anticipating what they might be worried about, thinking about what's on their hearts and minds. So knowing your stakeholders, those are all ways to kind of address that ripple effect when something does happen, either in your industry or in a competitive brand or something like that. I think those are all ways to combat that.
Yeah, it's interesting. We were having a conversation on a very similar topic with some clients and other colleagues a few weeks ago, and really came down to three things to consider on how you mitigate the ripple.
Mm-hmm.
And one is understanding what you're willing to stand up for. Another is really understanding your constituents and your stakeholders. Who is really, really critical? Who would you not give up or let go? Who do you really need to protect? And then the last is really understanding your appetite for risk. How much are you willing to risk? How far are you willing to push an envelope? That really does help inform your communication strategy and how much of a ripple you're likely to create or stem.
Absolutely.
Way.
Absolutely. Yes. Just a reminder, if you have questions, please either raise your hand and we can unmute you and you can ask your question, or type your question into the chat. We'll keep going with a couple of other advanced questions, but please submit whatever questions you have because we're looking forward to hearing what's on your mind. So
speaking of ongoing questions, I would love to hear from you, Amy, certified crisis expert. How do you know when you really have a crisis? Is there a lot of issues that bubble up in business every day that deserve time and attention, but don't necessarily constitute crisis?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one thing's important is to really understand when you have an issue and when you have a crisis. And I think, what I really think of as a crisis is something that has a very immediate and widespread impact on your reputation, on business operations, on your financial stability, and your trust with key stakeholders. I think those are all really important. An issue is really something where if it's not appropriately addressed, it could become a crisis, but it hasn't risen to that level yet. So that's kind of how we differentiate. An issue is something you're going to want to monitor day to day. Again, it's that kind of anticipating risk, making sure that you're paying attention to it and that you're managing it. But it could eventually become a crisis, which is why it's important to proactively manage it. I've got kind of 5 key questions that I like to look at when I'm trying to help clients determine, is this really something we want to elevate to a quote unquote crisis level? So the first is customer, team, or community safety at risk. So is there a safety risk with one of your key stakeholder groups? Does the incident or the situation impact your ability to do business or serve your customers? Could it result in a loss of trust with key people like your team, your leadership, your community, your customers? Does the incident affect or have potential to affect your overall reputation as a brand? And is it a situation in which you think media or social media communities are likely to get involved? Those are kind of the 5 questions that I really try to look at. And if the answer to, frankly, any one of those is yes, you really do want to take it seriously and start probably putting some crisis steps in motion. And maybe it ends up being an issue you mitigate, but it is elevated at that point enough that you should be addressing it as a crisis.
That makes a lot of sense. One thing that I know we've been dealing a lot with in recent months are weather-related crises, things that are beyond our control as people and as businesses. And while those are, maybe not necessarily about trust, they do have a huge impact on an organization's ability to continue to do business. So just things to think about if you are preparing a crisis plan, if you're doing prep inside your organization, is to really think about that intersectionality between crisis communication and business continuity.
Yes.
And I think that is one instance in particular where those 2 things really do line up. You want to make sure you've got the right partners internally and externally on board to help make sure that you can get back to operations as quickly as you possibly can.
Absolutely. I think that's great. One thing that's been interesting about the SVB situation specifically is I think there's an interesting dynamic going on between communication and regulation. There's that can be a tricky thing to navigate sometimes. So wondering, what's your thought on how to balance the need to communicate with also following regulatory or legal guidelines? Because that can be a challenge.
I hope everybody on the line is chuckling to themselves right now and saying, oh yeah, we've been there. We've felt that and experienced it. Because I think that is probably one of the biggest challenges that communicators face all the time is balancing our inherent need and desire to communicate with what we know might be legally or from a regulation perspective in the best interests of the organization. So I think, some of the things that we always try to keep in mind, first and foremost, are what are the risks and the benefits? What are the risks if you communicate versus if you don't? And that's to all stakeholders. And really understanding that if you choose to communicate to some stakeholders, you really need to be prepared to at least respond to all, because this is a 24/7 highly connected communication environment. Technology has really changed our ability to sort of contain response. So if you choose to respond or to communicate, really knowing what's in bounds and what's out of bounds. And that leads me to another strong consideration, which is make sure that you've got great relationships with your legal and compliance colleagues.
So important.
Learning who those people are and trying to build a relationship in the middle of a crisis is probably not the ideal time. So find those friends, understand what each other does, and share information, really get in their heads about what are their concerns and how do they make decisions on behalf of the organization, because their job is to protect and your job is to maintain reputation and loyalty, and they don't necessarily have to be at odds.
Right.
So I think that's a really critical point. And then, again, how to get a seat at the table. So being prepared, having a plan in place in advance and understanding, generally speaking, where your organization is comfortable playing is always going to be a helpful starting point. But finding your voice as a counselor, staying really aware of what's going on in your particular industry and keeping tabs on what's going on with key competitors and how they may have responded in similar situations is going to make you an invaluable advocate at that decision-making table. So don't be afraid to use your voice, and certainly don't be afraid to engage in a healthy dialogue with other leaders, compliance, and legal advisors who, may, based on their past experience, not be aware of some of the things that have evolved and transpired in communication and in best practices. Be that advocate, but also be willing to compromise. And really understand there is a point when you do need to stand down or you do need to be a little more circumspect. But really, I think that education and that relationship piece are really, really critical to ultimately the best counsel for your organization. And really, when it comes down to it, you're all on the same team or shooting for the best response, best possible outcome.
Yeah, and I think that just that day-to-day mindset is how you earn that seat. I think in the middle of a crisis is not when, it's to your point, it's not when you want to start, getting to know your legal counsel. It's not when you want to try to get that seat at the strategic table. It's in the day-to-day of how you operate as a communication professional, is to really show up that you understand the business, you understand the financials, you understand the competitive set, you understand the marketplace, demonstrating that day in and day out, both in terms of looking at risk as well as all the things that you mentioned, I think is just such an important part of earning that seat. So that you can be there. I think when a crisis hits, you want to be part of that very first conversation. Communication should absolutely be part of that first conversation, but it's not always the go-to. Leaders don't always realize, especially if you're not already at that strategic table, they may not know to contact you right away, and speed is just absolutely of the essence in a crisis.
Right, I want to take a little pause there. It looks like we had one comment come in looking for a third point on when something becomes a crisis.
Yeah, the third point was if the situation could result in loss of trust with key stakeholders. I should also mention that we are going to make this the recording of this webinar available to anyone who registered. So you will get it back that way, but that was the third point, was loss of trust. So thanks for asking.
And now I know that the chat function works, so I would love to see questions from all of you. I'm sure that somebody has one out there somewhere.
All right, looks like we've got one. As part of being prepared for a crisis of any kind, would you recommend timely boilerplate statements to have close by and that you can quickly customize? And where is a good place to find those? You want to take that one?
I can take a pass and you can jump.
All right, beautiful.
I think one of the things that we always recommend to clients is to think through what some of your most likely crisis scenarios would be, and to at least have a starting point for some responsive statements.
Yes.
We know that the first hour or so during a crisis response really sets the tone for how communication is likely to flow from there. So making sure that you have something available and are indicating to what level you can respond and when you can get back on your next follow-up or what those next touch points would be, it's always a good place to start. In terms of where to keep those things, I really recommend that you have a hard copy, old school version somewhere that you and your team can find and keep centrally located. I personally have carried around hard copies in the trunk of my car for years and years. But it's also, digital times, digital age. So any type of a SharePoint site or a server that you might be able to access remotely. If you don't want to carry a hard copy, something on a jump drive that you can keep attached to your keys is a great way to go about it. But I think the other thing is just to make sure that there are multiple copies in multiple places and that you have a pretty deep bench of folks who know A, what it is, and B, where it is, and then what the criteria is to dig that thing out and look at it.
Right. I think too, knowing what your approval process is really important. So the more you can template something ahead of time. So again, to Nikki's point, thinking about some likely scenarios, is a really good practice for any, crisis preparedness. I think having a really good solid holding statement. So I usually try to make sure that when I work with clients, just to have an initial statement you can put out there to say, here's what's happened in the situation. Here's what we can share at this point in time, more to come. Again, just to kind of fill that vacuum of silence, assuming that it is the right move to actually communicate in that scenario. It's always good to have kind of that holding statement. So then you can come back over the top of that one once you either have more information to provide or more perspective to share. But having that ready is really important, but really being clear on what the approval process is. Who needs to sign off on it? How quickly can they do that? Because again, time is of the essence in those situations. And you want to make sure that you're able to be part of that conversation at the right point in time.
A lot of sense.
Yeah.
Right. Anything else? Oh, I see somebody else is typing. And you can pre-populate these, I promise. We'll read through them. While we're waiting for this other comment to pop in here. Amy, what do you think is the right time or the right place for communication to get to the crisis table?
Well, you may not be surprised to hear me say immediately, and actually before the crisis would actually be my real answer. We talked about earning that seat at the strategic table, and I think that, communication is such an important part of the strategic response when you're in a high risk, high stakes situation. I think, again, emotions run high. There's a lot at stake. And you really want to make sure you're communicating effectively. I think one of the issues with SVB is not only did they not say enough, but what they did say was vague. There was no context. It pushed the onus back onto their customers to say, hey, don't panic, stay calm. And, remember, we've supported you for forever, versus giving context to say, there's nothing more important to us than, the security of your finances. I mean, making sure that you are really thinking about putting yourself in the shoes of others, and communication, that's our skill set. That is what we know how to do. We know how to make those connections. We know how to anticipate the questions, the concerns that our stakeholders are going to have, again, both inside and outside the organization. And so I think having communication be there from the moment of crisis, but preferably before, it's hugely important, because I would argue that SVB either didn't have communication counsel or perhaps decided to ignore it, because it is really a big part of the downfall in that situation. It really created a panic situation.
And that is really interesting. A lot of the coverage that I have read of that particular situation attributes that bank's fall from being one of the top 20 banks in the country to being in a bailout situation, specifically to their communication approach. Mm-hmm. When in fact, had they been sharing transparently, stability information, reaching out to customers about safety, security, helping encourage loyalty, mm-hmm. They may possibly have been able to avoid the run that actually resulted in that situation. So having people at the strategic level, as well as people at the ready who are able to deploy really quickly in a crisis, I think is a really, really critical balance there.
Totally agree. We had one more question come in. Any recommendations on how to build trust with the communication plan through LP organization and prevent leaders and employees from going rogue with their own communication? It's a really good question. I can take it again. Sorry, and then I'll let you jump in too. I think with the communication plan, one of the things that's really important is to socialize it and make sure the organization knows that you have a plan in place. Certainly making sure you have alignment from leaders and kind of the key players that would be involved in a crisis response is first and foremost. But I do think it's important that the organization knows there is a plan and a process in place and where they fit in that. That alone can give some real security, I think, to folks in the organization. It's also important for people to remember, if you have processes in place for who talks to the media, that should be something that's really clear throughout your organization. Remembering your frontline. So people who are answering the phones, people who are working frontline with customers, making sure that they know if something goes wrong or if there's a situation. It's important to reach out to them really proactively and let them know you're going to be equipping them with, how to respond to questions, how to manage any, inquiries that come in. Thinking about all those different folks in the organization is going to be really important for certainly the deployment of the crisis plan. But even just letting folks know that they have it, they don't need to know the nuance and the detail of it, but they do need to know that there is a plan and a process in place, and that they will be brought in on, kind of as they're needed and as their skill set determines it.
One other thing that has worked very well for some of our other clients is what I would call a preemptive strike. And that really is making sure that at any regular company touch point, whether that's a quarterly town hall or an annual meeting or team and department meetings, that communication has an opportunity to let people know who they are, what they do, and what they're working on behalf of the organization. So that you can always weave in, and as a reminder, in the event of a crisis, here's what we have in place. Or if a crisis actually strikes, that's not the first time that they hear of you and the people in your department, that there is a level of trust built in, because they know that the communication team has been working on behalf of employees, customers, and community all along. Mm-hmm. And that level of trust in the department really leads to a level of trust for the plan and what comes next.
That's a great point. Yep, absolutely.
So I think leaders maybe fall into that discussion as well.
Goodness.
What's role of a leader in a crisis?
Yes, absolutely. Well, and I think, again, going back to SVB, I think the CEO, was the spokesperson in the scenario, and obviously was not terribly effective in his communication there. I think with leaders, again, you want to have really strong alignment, certainly with how you want to, approach a crisis, what the crisis plan is, and what each leader's role would be within that communication framework. But not unlike making sure that there's trust with the communication team, making sure your leader has trust within the organization is really important. And I think, leaders have the ability to help people feel more stable and secure through communication. So I think a lot about the leaders and the employee situation. So, employees are impacted by crisis as much as your external stakeholders are. And I think for a leader to make sure that they are very consistent in their communication with the team is incredibly important. It helps while it can still be distracting, it pulls a lot of the unknown out of the situation so that your employees can focus on what they need to really work on and what they need to be focused on so that you can get back to business as usual, as you can get through that business continuity curve. So I think leaders have an incredibly important role, certainly inside the organization. They're often the external spokespeople as well. But you want to make sure you've got the right spokesperson talking. So figuring out kind of what the situation is. And it's not always going to be the CEO who should be speaking in a crisis situation, making sure your leaders are media trained, making sure that, again, they're really clear on who you are as an organization, those values, that mission and purpose statement, having that clarity so that when it does come time for them to talk, that they're able to ground everything back to that really kind of core central, who are we, what do we stand for, and what does that mean in the lens of the situation at hand.
That's great. So that's a good lens on leaders. And leaders could be anybody from a CEO to anybody else sitting in the C-suite. Are there other partners or resources that are important to pull into that conversation, either early on or maybe even when you're developing a plan, like the ones that we've been discussing in the chat questions?
Yeah, I would definitely say it's when you're developing the plan that you want to make sure that you're really clear on which leaders should be part, certainly of kind of that core crisis team. So we look for, really thinking about your stakeholders and, who is the leader or who is the person that's going to help you communicate with that stakeholder group, or will have the understanding of that stakeholder group so that you can address those concerns and questions. So at a minimum, we look to have partners in legal, we look to have partners in HR, we look to have partners in marketing, anything that's customer facing. And then depending on the situation, that can expand to have someone perhaps in facilities. If you have a product development leader that you would need to bring in, if it's product recall, for instance, or anyone in kind of a security emergency response. A little of that is organizational dependent and the type of organization that you are. So in healthcare, you're going to probably have a slightly different, group of leaders you're going to bring in than if you're in a manufacturing organization. But at the very core, I would look for some mix of legal, HR, marketing, customers, of course, leaders, and communication. And remember, legal can be compliance, that can be regulatory. There's some different arms within that, and that's a little bit organizational specific, but that's kind of the core that I look for in a really strong crisis team. Makes sense.
Yeah. Any other questions from out in the crowd? I think it's really funny that I'm looking at this sea of circles and initials. I can't see anybody's faces, but would love other questions if there are any out there.
Yeah, we've got about 10 minutes left. So if you have questions, now is a great time to put those into the chat or raise your hand and we can answer them verbally as well. Otherwise, we can keep a couple other questions that we have here. Let's see. How do you maintain trust in a crisis? Trust is so important. How do you hold that if your organization is in the midst of a crisis?
Okay, for the purpose of this question, we're going to assume that you had trust to begin with.
Yes, that's pretty important.
So we will assume that you have a good bank of trust out there and that something has gone wrong. So in order to maintain that level of trust, I think the first thing is to really take a look at your organizational values and say, what do we know about the situation that has emerged and what do our values tell us about how we should respond? And are we willing to stand by our values right now? I mean, those values are internal facing, they're customer facing, they really set a roadmap of expectation in the way that your key stakeholders expect you to respond. So not to forget those, to really make sure that you are delivering on your organizational values is really, really important. Also, from a pure communications perspective, staying connected and sharing what you can when you can, and being really transparent about what I can't, I can't answer that question. What I could tell you or what I can tell you is this. So making sure that you're not shutting down, that you're not going dark, that you continue to be available, be visible, be present. And then also making sure that you do what you say you're going to do.
Yeah.
And that really matters to all of your constituents. So if you tell the news media, I don't have anything that I can share right now, but I should have an update from local authorities in about an hour. Then in about an hour, get back to those reporters, whether or not you have an update.
Mhm.
I said I'd get back to you in an hour. I don't have any new information. Continues to build trust that will help you in the long run if you don't have new information to share. And I think that same principle really applies to customers and employees as well. You know, here's what we can tell you. Here's what we're doing. Here's what we know. And then making sure that you're available for questions and listening. So in a crisis, our inclination is to push out as much information or to hold back as much information as we think is appropriate to the situation. What we don't want to do is lose that 360 communication loop. So the more we can listen and understand how our communities are feeling, how our employees are feeling, how our customers are feeling, the more we can listen and understand, the more we can embed that in our response and make sure that we aren't operating in a vacuum, that we're really staying in step with other things that are developing, you know, potentially in tandem or as a result of the crisis that we're enduring.
That active listening is so important. And I think that's something that is often forgotten because, again, we're human. And in a crisis, emotions run high. You want to push out information. You want to quell whatever's happening. And taking that minute to really listen is not only important for just the input that it provides, but it also makes sure that whatever communication you do put out there, you're hitting the mark. You're really addressing the questions, the concerns, the things that people are thinking about, that they're worried about. It's just really important. And it's something we should be doing the whole way through. So yes, certainly when the crisis hits, but there are multiple points when we want to be listening throughout really just the lifespan of a crisis and the arc of a crisis. So from start to finish.
So thinking about that lifespan of a crisis, back to SVB, which is where we started this conversation, that really started as a moment in time that turned into an ooze that it went from impacting one organization to impacting an entire industry. And I think there were probably touch points all along the way that could have shifted the outcome of that whole situation. So are there phases of a crisis or different touch points that you want to think about? Because it is, if you're lucky, it's a one and done and you kind of shut it down and it you know, you cool it off and it goes away. But that's not always the case. So if it's something that's going to be around for a while, what are some of those phases or milestones that you look for?
Yeah, when I think about crisis, I typically think about it in kind of 4 key phases or kind of well, we'll go with phases. Phases make sense. The first is simply the ready phase, and that's the preparation, the planning that we've talked about, making sure that you are aligned before a crisis hits, making sure that you're building goodwill and trust, and that you've got clarity on, you know, who is going to be on point. So making sure that all those key pieces are in place, and that, again, that identifying risks piece fits in there. So really being ready at all times, because a crisis can strike really at any point in time. Everyone always says it's not if, but when. True, very true story. So it's really making sure that you're ready for that if and when it happens. Phase 2 is the response. So that's when you're really activating your plan. That's when you take the plan you put in place, you put it into practice, you're really activating, you're communicating clearly, consistently, you're listening. That's really where that first round of listening comes in, really showing that you're demonstrating understanding for how people are feeling, what they're thinking about, what their questions are. Again, that anticipation is so important for holding trust and for really showing folks that you are doing your best to rise to the occasion and manage the situation to the best of your ability. And during that part, boy, using head and heart is so important. That's really where that, you know, the leader has an opportunity specifically to show head and heart. Be smart, be clear, show empathy. You know, I think those are really, really important things in that response phase. The third phase is what I always call the recover phase. So this is really where you're taking a minute to understand, you know, how have expectations changed based on the situation or the crisis that has occurred. So with SVB, it's what's changed in the industry. You know, and I think one thing we know from that situation is there was a lack of trust. There was instability. There's a lot of uncertainty. So we know that, you know, consumers are kind of churning on, I don't know who to trust. I don't know where to put my money. I don't know if I can trust my bank. And so really understanding how those expectations have shifted and what it's going to take to move forward successfully as your organization. So looking at things like, how do you manage that lingering uncertainty? How do you continue to listen and use those insights based on what you're hearing from your employees, from your customers, from your frontline staff? And then how do you think about how the crisis may impact things like your values, your mission, your purpose? Does it change anything? Does it change how you talk to your consumers or to your employees or your stakeholders? What has changed? And then the last phase is really what I like to call restore. And that is where you're really reflecting. So after every crisis, you want to debrief with your team and talk about how did it go? How did we manage it? What would we do differently? But really importantly, how do we move forward with confidence and with clarity? And what's the opportunity? So every crisis, believe it or not, may not feel like it in a crisis, but every crisis is an opportunity. And so what is your organization's opportunity out of a crisis? What is the future focus message? What's the future focus actions you want to put in place that are going to be different because of the crisis? And so really taking the time to do that, I think, is what really will help you come out of it successfully and be able to move forward in a really strong way. So
That's great. Yeah, well, we just have a couple of minutes left here.
Cool.
So if there are any last questions, either by voice or chat, we would love those. Otherwise, Amy, how do we get recordings of this and what happens next?
All right. So we will reach out to all of you that registered, and we will provide a copy of the recording for you to take a look at, share with your team, whatever is helpful to you there. And then also just, know that Nikki and I are available for one-on-one conversations. If there's anything that you are thinking about in your organization, or if you want to just, kind of continue the conversation, Nikki and I are happy to chat anytime. You can always reach out to Beehive for a one-on-one conversation. Yeah, and then we've got a number of crisis resources on our website. So if you are looking for, an assessment on, are you ready for a crisis? How to kind of figure out if your organization is ready. Looking at how to think about those 4 phases that I walked through. We have a lot of free resources on our website that are available to you to take a look at if that's helpful. Looks like about one other person typing, but I will do one last call for any other questions. Well, all right. Well, in that case, I will thank you all very much for spending 45 minutes with us. I hope this was helpful. I hope you got some good value out of the conversation. And again, please feel free to follow up directly one-on-one with Nikki or I if you want to talk any further.
Thanks, everyone.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.